When Harold Wentworth found the letter from his fired driver, his world began to crumble. Family secrets, conspiracies, and betrayal by those closest to him forced him into action. What he did next would shock even the most experienced. But let's start from the beginning. Harold Wentworth was the kind of millionaire everyone considered the epitome of success. The construction empire he built spanned the country, from towering skyscrapers to the most prestigious residential complexes. Every deal, every signed contract brought him millions, but lately, money no longer satisfied him. Surrounded by luxury and influence, Harold realized that behind all the glitter lay loneliness. No one in his circle was a true friend, only business partners, and even they were eyeing their own piece of the pie. Harold was a man with a sharp sense of control. He loved everything in his life to be perfect, from the diamond cufflinks on his sleeves to his meticulously arranged schedule of meetings. But if anyone deviated even a millimeter from his rules, whether a colleague or a family member, his patience quickly wore thin. And unfortunately for Bob, his driver, he became one of those who irritated Harold. Bob had served Wentworth loyally for over 10 years. He was a simple guy, used to silence, punctuality, and professionalism. Unlike others in Harold's circle, Bob never flattered or pretended to be someone he wasn't. But recently, something had changed. Harold began to notice small things that started to get under his skin. Sometimes Bob was a minute late when he was supposed to be waiting at the door. Other times, his glance in the rearview mirror seemed evasive, as if he was hiding something. Maybe they were minor issues, but to Harold, there were no minor issues. Every day, getting into the car, Wentworth found himself thinking that something was bothering his driver. A couple of times he even tried to start a conversation, but it always ended in silence. Bob was a reserved man, and the barrier between them only fueled Harold's internal frustration. It got to the point where even the way Bob opened the door began to irritate him. It felt like a personal challenge, as if every gesture Bob made concealed an unspoken dissatisfaction that Harold couldn't explain. Then one day, after another stressful day, Wentworth realized he couldn't tolerate it any longer. It was one of those days when everything went wrong. A crucial contract fell through, partners made impossible demands, and even a family lunch ended in an argument with his wife. Bob stood at the gate, as always, but something about his behavior seemed especially defiant to Harold. Maybe it was the way he opened the car door, or the way he glanced at his boss over his shoulder. That was the final straw. Climbing the marble staircase of his luxurious home, Harold stopped at the doors of his office. Normally, he would have thought it over again, but today his nerves were frayed. He needed a sense of control. He needed to put someone in their place. Without hesitation, he called Bob inside. The driver entered calmly as always, but there was still that silent protest in his eyes that Wentworth couldn't stand. "Listen, Bob." Harold tried to keep his voice cold and distant. "I've thought about this long enough. Your behavior lately has been unacceptable. I can't tolerate it any longer. You're fired. Pack your things and don't come back." Bob, as composed as ever, didn't argue. He stood calmly, with only a flicker of deep bitterness in his eyes. He nodded quietly, turned, and left. No more words were spoken. Wentworth felt triumphant. It seemed to him that by getting rid of Bob, he had regained control. But behind this apparent victory lay something far bigger, something he had yet to discover. The next day, Harold Wentworth, still savoring the feeling of freedom from Bob, dove headfirst into his work. The morning negotiations with key clients went well, and his mood began to improve. He was convinced that now, without the strange tension in his interactions with the driver, his life would get back on track. Control had been restored, and it gave him a sense of inner peace. He relished how everyone around him listened to him without question, how business went smoothly, and how every detail of his day was perfectly planned. However, around noon, his phone vibrated with a message from his wife, Jane. Wentworth read her brief text. "I found something in the car." At first, he didn't give it much thought, assuming she might have found some trinket Bob had left behind. Perhaps a receipt or a forgotten item. Harold wasn't one to pay attention to such details. Whatever it was no longer his concern. Still, by the end of the day, a sense of unease began to creep into his thoughts. Why had Jane even bothered to tell him about it? Why hadn't she just thrown it away? Wentworth was not the type to leave questions unanswered, especially when it concerned his domain. That evening, when he returned home, he headed to the garage to see what his wife had found. The car was parked in its usual spot. Inside, it was empty except for something small, neatly folded on the front seat. Harold moved closer and saw a folded letter. He almost chuckled to himself. A letter? Maybe it's just an old note or an ad, something Bob left by mistake, he thought. Over the years, many small things had accumulated, and Harold was sure this was just another random document. But as soon as he took the letter in his hands, the uneven texture of the paper gave him pause. Unfolding the letter, Harold saw a line that made his heart skip a beat. Dear Harold, I've wanted to tell you the truth for a long time, but I didn't know how. These words sent a chill down his spine. He stopped, reading the opening line again in disbelief. Who could have written this? What truth? And why had the letter ended up in his car? Wentworth slowly sat down on the edge of the seat, feeling panic grow inside him. He continued reading. The letter, written in a strong, confident hand, mentioned things only people close to his family could know. Secrets Harold had long buried deep in his memory. It referenced his father, a man who had always been a mysterious figure to Harold, and events from his childhood that he had tried to forget. But the most shocking thing was that the letter didn't just mention old family secrets. It suggested that all this time, someone had known about them and used this information to stay close to him. Each subsequent line intensified his sense of dread. I've known your family longer than you think, the letter continued. I watched you grow up, change. All this time, I've been nearby, protecting you. But there were things I couldn't tell you then. Now, as you read this, you may already know who I am. Harold could no longer hold back his emotions. His palms were sweaty and his throat was dry. He felt as though something inevitable was closing in on him, as if a shadow loomed over his fate. At the end of the letter was a single sentence that completely shattered his composure. Now you know why I've always been by your side. These words echoed in his mind. Why by his side? Why was it so important now? Harold scanned the letter again, trying to find any clue that might explain what it all meant. Who wrote the letter? Bob? But how could his driver know such intimate details about his life, his family, his past? Now his head was full of questions, each one more terrifying than the last. The letter held a threat, as if someone had been watching him all along, knowing things that Wentworth had long forgotten or tried to forget. This person was far closer than Harold had ever imagined. The millionaire, who was used to controlling everything and everyone around him for the first time in many years, felt his life slipping out of control. The shock of the letter still haunted Harold, even after he returned to the house. Questions pounded in his head. What was this letter? How could Bob have been connected to his family? The more he thought about the details, the clearer it became. This was no random note. It was part of a story Harold had never known, one that was perhaps tied to his past. That evening, Harold couldn't sleep. He kept going over the letter in his mind, the words echoing incessantly. I have always been by your side. Who was this person? Why did they know so much about the Wentworth family? And most importantly, what role did Bob play in all of this? The next morning, Harold decided not to waste any time and start his investigation. His first step was to look through his late mother's old documents. In the archives kept in the family library, he found numerous papers related to the family's business, assets, and connections. After several hours of searching, Harold stumbled upon a contract dated decades ago. This contract was between his mother and Bob. The agreement stated that Bob was hired not just as a driver, but as a trusted associate. His duties went beyond ensuring safe transportation. He was tasked with protecting Harold from external threats. The contract had been signed just months before his mother's death. A cold chill ran down Harold's spine. Everything he had ever known about Bob had been just the tip of the iceberg. Bob wasn't just a driver. He was her protector, a guardian. But who was he protecting Harold from? And what danger had been lurking all this time? Further research led to even more shocking revelations. Harold recalled a series of strange events that had occurred over the past few years. The failures of major deals, sudden contract terminations, and even betrayals by his most trusted partners. At the time, these incidents seemed like random misfortunes, just part of the ups and downs of business. But now, in light of this new information, they began to appear as carefully orchestrated blows aimed at undermining his position and wealth. The deeper Harold delved into his past, the more a conspiracy came into focus. The letter hinted that his life and business had been under threat for many years, and Bob had been the only one standing between him and this conspiracy. Harold realized that Bob had been fulfilling his mother's final directive, to protect him from those who sought to take the Wentworth family fortune. But now, with Bob gone, Harold was alone in the face of a danger he didn't yet fully understand. Every past business failure now seemed like part of a larger game in which Harold had been merely a pawn. Someone, as yet unknown to him, wanted to take over his fortune, destroy his empire, and strip him of everything. And this person had been acting covertly, slowly chipping away at the foundations of his life, while Bob had fought back in silence. Now that Bob was gone, this enemy could reveal themselves completely. Harold felt that a critical moment was approaching, one that could change everything. The letter made it clear that the conspiracy touched not just his business, but his entire family. Harold couldn't help but wonder, who among those closest to him was involved in this conspiracy? Who among the people he trusted had betrayed him for money? He recalled certain suspicious moments in his wife Jane's behavior. Her cold stares, her sudden disappearances for meetings with friends. He began to suspect that the conspiracy wasn't just coming from external enemies, but from within his own family. His mother had foreseen this danger and left him a protector in Bob, but now that his protector was gone, Harold would have to figure things out on his own. After uncovering the secret connection between Bob and his mother, Harold Wentworth tried to focus on work, but the string of unsettling events continued to disrupt his usual rhythm. At first, it was just a faint disturbance, but with each passing day, the feeling that his world was crumbling grew stronger. Business partners who had once been loyal allies suddenly began behaving strangely. One abruptly backed out of a deal, while another proposed odd terms that were clearly unfavorable for Harold. But the most shocking blow came with the news that one of his senior business associates, Michael Langston, had unexpectedly taken his own life. Michael had been someone Harold had worked with for over a decade, and their business relationship had always been solid and productive. Langston understood the nuances of the construction industry better than anyone, and their joint projects had generated millions. The news of his suicide shook not only Harold, but the entire business elite of the city. Headlines filled the newspapers, reporting Langston's company's bankruptcy and his sudden demise. This incident set off a chain of suspicions in Harold's mind. He couldn't understand how Michael's life had unraveled so quickly. But the more Harold thought about it, the more he suspected that there was something more to the story. It might not have been just a tragic coincidence or personal crisis. In Harold's mind, a picture was forming, one in which he, like Michael, was merely a pawn, a victim of manipulation. Amidst this strange and tense period, his wife Jane began acting more distant. In the past, they would often discuss business, future plans, although her interest in the company had always been minimal. Now, however, Jane had completely withdrawn. She avoided conversations about family finances, and whenever Harold tried to bring up plans for the future or business matters, she would shut down. It irritated and unnerved him. One night, unable to sleep, Harold went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. Passing by the office, he overheard Jane's muffled voice. She was on the phone, and although she was speaking quietly, Harold caught a few phrases that troubled him. "Yes, he doesn't suspect a thing." And even more disturbingly, "We'll be able to finish this soon." But the most chilling sentence came a moment later. "Harold's already lost control. He's too caught up in his own problems." Those words hit him like a knife. She had said his name, but it was spoken without any affection or concern. Harold stood frozen at the door, trying to process what he had just heard. His growing suspicions that the conspiracy involved those closest to him suddenly became a harsh reality. He now realized that everything that had been happening wasn't random. His family, his business, everything was under attack, and Jane was part of it. The next morning, Harold made a decision. He could no longer rely on his gut feelings and vague suspicions. He hired a private investigator, a specialist in complex and delicate cases. Harold couldn't trust anyone in his inner circle, so the investigator was his only chance to uncover the truth. The man worked quickly and thoroughly, gathering information, meeting with former employees, and discreetly surveilling Harold's business partners. Several weeks passed, and one day the investigator returned with shocking results. What he had uncovered surpassed even Harold's darkest suspicions. It turned out that Jane, along with one of his business partners, Richard Stone, had been planning to take over his business and wealth for some time. Their scheme was elaborate and meticulously planned. They had orchestrated the firing of key employees, manipulated documents, and even bribed lawyers to strip Harold of control over his empire. But the most terrifying revelation was that they had started their plot long before Harold even suspected anything. Everything that had happened over the past few years, the sudden business failures, the betrayals by partners, even Michael Langston's death, was all part of their sinister game. Langston had been one of the few who had tried to stand against the conspiracy, and his death now seemed less like a suicide and more like the result of pressure from the conspirators. The investigator presented Harold with undeniable proof: recorded phone conversations, forged documents, testimony from employees who had been fired under the guise of company restructuring. Harold was shaken to his core. The one person he had trusted the most, his wife, was among those who had been plotting to ruin him. The evidence revealed that Jane and Richard planned to complete their takeover in just a few months. They believed Harold had been weakened by the series of blows and was on the verge of handing over control of the business. Now that the truth was out, Harold had to decide what to do next. He realized that time was running out and that he needed to act swiftly and decisively. Once Harold had gathered all the evidence and the full scope of the conspiracy had been laid bare before him, he knew he could no longer afford to wait. Time was of the essence, and every day brought his enemies closer to delivering their final blow. But now that he knew the truth, he had a chance to turn the tables in his favor. And Harold decided to strike first. The first step was to arrange a meeting with Jane and his business partners, including Richard Stone. Harold made sure the meeting looked like a routine business dinner. He even made a few concessions in the paperwork to give his enemies the impression that they were on the verge of success. To Jane and Richard, this seemed like the final step in their plan. They thought Harold was already broken by his string of failures and ready to hand over control of the company. The meeting was scheduled at one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. When everyone gathered around the table, the atmosphere felt tense, but Harold remained calm. Jane sat next to him, her face as composed as ever, while Richard, confident as always, exuded his usual air of superiority. Harold, on the other hand, appeared outwardly serene, which aroused no suspicion. He knew that they were in for a shock they weren't prepared for. In the midst of discussing business plans and future contracts, as Jane and Richard confidently discussed the upcoming division of assets, Harold decided it was time. He stood up, pulled the folded letter from his pocket, and spoke in a clear, commanding voice. "Before we continue, there's something important I need to share with all of you." All eyes turned to him. Jane and Richard froze, their smiles fading. Tension hung in the air. Harold unfolded the letter and began reading it aloud. With every line, every mention of family secrets and the dangers Bob had tried to prevent, the faces of his enemies grew paler. When Harold reached the words, "Now you know why I've always been by your side," Jane turned red, her hand trembling slightly, her eyes darting nervously. Richard tried to maintain his composure, but his confidence had vanished. They realized their plan had been exposed and that Harold knew everything. Then, with cold precision, Harold pulled out the documents his lawyers had prepared. These contained all the evidence of their conspiracy: phone call recordings, forged signatures on contracts, bribed lawyers, and financial fraud. He tossed the folder onto the table in front of Jane and Richard, spilling the incriminating pages across the table. "I knew what you were planning," Harold said, his voice low but firm. "And I've already done everything to not only stop you, but to destroy you." Jane clenched her fists, her breathing quickening. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. Richard, realizing their plan had completely fallen apart, also didn't know what to say. He stood up, intending to leave, but Harold stopped him. "Sit down. This is far from over." The consequences didn't take long to unfold. The next day, Harold filed lawsuits against his partners, accusing them of fraud and attempting a hostile takeover of his company. The media quickly picked up the story, and the scandal erupted with astonishing speed. Jane and Richard found themselves embroiled in legal chaos. Their reputations were shattered, and their businesses quickly lost investments and market trust. Financial losses mounted, and soon all their assets began crumbling under the weight of the allegations. Jane, frightened by the impending exposure and legal consequences, fled. She disappeared overnight, leaving behind only a brief message to Harold, apologizing and promising never to return. By that point, Harold no longer felt anything for her. No anger, no regret, no pain. Richard, having lost his company and control over the situation, was forced to concede defeat. His business career ended as swiftly as it had begun. In a single night, his influence and fortune collapsed, leaving him in debt and with severed business connections. Harold, in the end, was left nearly alone. His business had been saved, but at what cost? The millions in his accounts no longer brought him any joy. He had lost trust in the people closest to him, and the betrayal left a deep scar on his soul. He had not only survived the collapse of his relationships, but had also come to the painful realization that wealth could not shield him from pain and treachery. The only constant had been his mother's legacy. She had foreseen the possible threats and had left him a protector in the form of Bob. The letter Bob had left had saved his life and his honor. Harold finally understood that behind his successes, there had always been someone watching over him, silently protecting him from danger. The man he had dismissed without a second thought turned out to be the only one truly loyal to him until the very end.